Welcome, brave souls, to the realm of the unknown. Here, in the heart of darkness, we unravel the chilling tales that lurk in the shadows, stories that will grip your imagination and chill you to the core. Prepare yourself for spine-tingling narratives that delve into the depths of fear, where every whisper holds a secret and every shadow conceals a terror. Join our community of thrill-seekers as we explore the macabre, the mysterious, and the downright terrifying. But remember, once you enter, there's no turning back. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment of our haunting adventures. Are you ready to embrace the fear? The darkness awaits.
The year was 1884, and the air in the Canadian wilderness was sharp and frigid. The logging camp, nestled deep in the heart of uncharted forests, was bustling despite the biting cold. Men swung their axes rhythmically, felling ancient trees for timber that would feed the ever-expanding railroads and cities. Among the men was Patrick Cleary, a grizzled logger known for his brute strength and relentless ambition. Patrick's greed knew no bounds. While most men followed the rules set by the foreman, Henry Devlin, a young but experienced leader, Patrick was always looking for shortcuts. He mocked the old tale shared by the indigenous guides who warned of sacred trees and forbidden lands. To Patrick, the forest was just a sea of profits waiting to be harvested. One fateful morning, Patrick ventured further than the rest of the crew. As the mist hung low and the sun barely pierced through the towering pines, he stumbled upon an enormous tree. Its gnarled roots twisted like ancient hands clawing at the earth, and strange markings adorned its bark. It seemed almost alive, whispering faintly in the wind. Ignoring the unease prickling at the back of his neck, Patrick hefted his axe. "A tree's a tree," he muttered, striking the first blow. The axe sunk deep, but instead of sap, a dark, viscous liquid oozed from the wound. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and an unnatural wail echoed through the forest, sending birds scattering into the sky. By the time Patrick returned to camp, he was pale and quiet, but he dismissed his unease with a gruff wave. That night, the forest grew deathly silent. No wolves howled, no owls hooted, only the eerie sound of the wind slipping through the trees. Henry noticed something was off, but chalked it up to the fatigue of the men. The next morning, the camp awoke to screams. One of the loggers, Jacob, was missing from his bunk. A trail of blood led into the forest, where the others found his mutilated body hanging high in the branches, his eyes wide with terror. Fear swept through the camp, but Patrick dismissed it as a wolf attack. However, as days passed, more men began to vanish, one by one. Their bodies were found torn apart, their faces frozen in unnatural grimaces. Those who weren't killed became strange, withdrawn, their eyes sunken and their movements jerky. They muttered under their breath about hunger and shadows. Henry began to notice that Patrick was acting particularly odd, his skin graying and his appetite insatiable. One night, Henry awoke to a sound outside his cabin. Peering through the frosted window, he saw Patrick hunched over the corpse of another logger, gnawing at his flesh. His eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, and his shadow stretched impossibly long, as if something far greater and more monstrous loomed behind him. Realizing the camp was cursed, Henry sought answers. He found the indigenous guide, Thomas, who had been hesitant to stay but had remained out of loyalty. Thomas confirmed Henry's worst fears. Patrick had awakened a Wendigo, a malevolent spirit of insatiable hunger. The sacred tree was its prison, and by cutting it, Patrick had released it. Now, the Wendigo spirit was spreading like a plague, turning men into ravenous monsters. Wendigo thrives on greed, Thomas explained. It twists those who hunger for more into its thralls. You must destroy Patrick before it consumes you all. Armed with only an old hunting rifle, Henry and Thomas devised a plan. They would lure Patrick and the Wendigo spirit within him back to the sacred tree. According to Thomas, the only way to seal the spirit was to burn Patrick's body at the tree's roots. That night, the camp turned into a battleground. Patrick, now fully transformed into a monstrous Wendigo with elongated limbs and hollowed eyes, hunted the remaining men. His guttural growls echoed through the camp as Henry and Thomas led him on a desperate chase through the woods. When they reached the sacred tree, Henry lit the fire while Thomas chanted an ancient incantation. Patrick lunged at Henry, his claws raking across his shoulder, but with a final, desperate effort, Henry shoved him into the flames. The Wendigo's scream was unearthly, shaking the very ground. As the fire consumed Patrick's body, the forest fell silent once more. The dark presence lifted, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Henry and the few survivors left the camp the next morning, vowing never to return. Years later, the story of the cursed logging camp became a whispered legend. Locals avoided the area, saying the forest still carried the Wendigo's whispers. And deep in the wilderness, the sacred tree grew once more, its roots tangled around the charred remains of those who had disturbed its peace. The Alaskan winter was unforgiving, a vast, frozen wasteland where the sun rarely rose above the horizon and the snow seemed to stretch endlessly into a white void. The Eagle's Nest Research Station, a remote scientific outpost perched atop the Arctic Circle, had been built to withstand the harsh elements. Its purpose was simple but vital: to study the rapid shifts in the climate, to monitor the changing patterns of the ice, and to understand the forces shaping the Earth's future. A small team of scientists and researchers were gathered there, isolated from the world for months at a time. Among them was Dr. Anna Larson, a climatologist with a sharp mind and a growing sense of dread. She had been at the station for 3 weeks, cataloging temperature shifts and glacial movements. But something about the station's eerie silence made her uneasy. She dismissed the feeling as simple isolation, but as the days dragged on, the strange occurrences piled up. The station had been built atop an ancient glacial ridge, and during their initial surveys, the team had discovered something buried beneath the ice, something that defied all logic. It wasn't an animal carcass or a fragment of ancient human civilization. No, it was something far older, something unnatural. It was a body, but not like any body they had ever seen. The discovery had been made during a routine drill to take ice core samples. The drill had struck something hard, much harder than the frozen layers of ice. Beneath the ice, in the pitch-black depths of the glacier, lay a twisted, emaciated figure, frozen in a block of ice. It was humanoid, but its limbs were far too long, its body gaunt and contorted in grotesque angles. Its face was a deathly mask, twisted into an expression of eternal hunger. Its eyes were sunken deep into its skull, but something about the creature, something in the shape of its mouth, the stretch of its hands, felt wrong. It was almost as if it was waiting to be freed. At first, the team had assumed it was some sort of ancient being, perhaps a relic of a long-forgotten culture, or a creature preserved by the unyielding cold. But Anna felt something far darker in the air. A gut-wrenching sense of foreboding gnawed at her every time she looked at the figure, something primal that told her it shouldn't be touched. Still, their ambition got the better of them. They would document it, study it, and uncover its secrets. Science would win, no matter the cost. The thawing. Over the next few days, the temperature inside the research station grew erratic. The heating system, which had always functioned without issue, began to malfunction. The ice around the creature, this thing, began to thaw, and as it did, the temperature in the station grew warmer. A strange, acrid smell began to seep through the walls, and at night, the wind howled outside like something alive. Then the first death occurred. Dr. Simon Kessler, the lead archaeologist on the team, went missing. His disappearance was mysterious. No sign of struggle, no trace of blood. Just a trail of footprints leading into the blinding white of the snowstorm outside, and then nothing. His absence was unsettling, but what was worse was the voice. That evening, Anna had been in the lab, reviewing data, when she heard Simon's voice, clear as day, calling her name through the hallway. Anna, Anna, come here. It sounded like Simon. His tone was unmistakable, even in the chaos of the storm outside. But something in the way he called her name was off. It was wrong. She hesitated, staring toward the hallway where the voice had come from. It was faint, but unmistakable. Simon," she called out. There was no answer, just the faint sound of shuffling, the whisper of footsteps on the cold, concrete floor. She stood up, her heart pounding. Slowly, she made her way toward the sound, but when she reached the hallway, there was no one there. The station was empty. A dark chill crept through her, and just as she was about to turn back, the voice came again, closer now, just behind her. "Anna, please come out. I'm cold. I need you." The voice was no longer Simon's. It was different, distorted, echoing with a low, guttural rasp that made her skin crawl. She ran. The next morning, the body of Simon Kessler was found in the research station's storage room. His face was frozen in terror, his skin stretched taut over his skull, eyes wide with a look of sheer horror. But there was something else. His hands were marked with deep, claw-like scratches, as though something had tried to tear its way out from the inside. The others were shaken, but they chalked it up to the stress of isolation and the effects of the strange environmental conditions. Anna knew better. The creature beneath the ice had awakened, and it was far from dormant. The Wendigo. The deaths came quickly after that. Dr. Rebecca Miller, a biologist, was found torn apart in the station's supply room, her body twisted and mangled, with a look of sheer terror on her face. Jonah Walsh, the station's engineer, disappeared without a trace, only for his voice to echo through the intercoms, begging for help. Anna, help me. It's cold out here, please." His voice was cracked and frantic, but when she ran outside to find him, all she saw was the snow, endless, barren snow. Anna realized then what they had uncovered. Not just a creature, but a Wendigo, a malevolent, insatiable spirit from the frozen north. It could mimic voices, lure its victims into the wilderness with the sound of familiar calls, and then consume them. It thrived on isolation, on fear, on the hunger of those who dared to disturb the ancient, cursed things that slumbered beneath the ice. The creature had been frozen for centuries, trapped by a curse. But as the ice melted and the warmth of human presence disturbed the ancient burial ground, it had been freed. Anna was now the last one left. The voice mimicked Simon again, this time coming from the radio. "Anna, I need you. It's so cold here. I'm alone. Please come to me." But Anna knew better than to trust the voice. She had heard it once too many times to know the truth. It was the Wendigo. With a final, desperate act of courage, Anna set the station's self-destruct sequence, intending to bury the Wendigo beneath the ice once more. As the countdown echoed through the empty halls, she could hear it. The voice. Her name. Whispers from the cold. "Anna, it's me, please, just one more step." But she didn't look back. The explosion shattered the station, sending a massive shockwave through the frozen landscape. The creature, and the echoes of its hunger, were buried again beneath the snow, but Anna's fate was sealed. She vanished into the void of the Alaskan wilderness, her name lost to the winds. The voices still called to those who pass near the site, an eerie reminder of the darkness that waits in the depths of the ice. And the Wendigo, buried but not destroyed, waits patiently for the next soul to wander too close. The snowstorm hit without warning, descending on the small Appalachian town of Westfall like a slow, suffocating blanket. It wasn't the first snowstorm of the season, but it was the worst by far. Thick, swirling flakes piled high against the windows, obscuring any view of the world outside. The town, normally quiet in the winter months, now lay completely cut off. No electricity, no cell service, and no way in or out. Just snow and isolation. For Lyla Carter, the storm should have been another inconvenience in a life already full of small struggles. At 15, she was used to the long winters in Westfall, where the town's only grocery store became a social hub, and the occasional power outage was part of the rhythm of life. But this storm, this was different. Her father, Graham Carter, had been acting strange in the days leading up to the storm. Quiet, withdrawn, his eyes sunken with dark circles beneath them. He kept to the house, mumbling things Lyla didn't understand, and sometimes his gaze would linger too long on the woods outside, as if he were waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Lyla's mother had died when she was young, leaving Graham to raise her on his own. He had been a good father, kind, steady, with an almost uncanny way of making everything feel safe. But in the last few months, something had changed. His presence felt heavier, more distant. Lyla couldn't shake the feeling that something had awakened inside him, something dark and hungry. The storm trapped them in their modest cabin at the edge of town. By the second day, the power was out, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves circling their home. The isolation was suffocating, and yet it was the silence that terrified Lyla the most. No sounds from the usual animals that roamed the nearby woods. No calls from the neighbors. Just the wind and the faint, unsettling creak of the house settling in the cold. That night, something changed. Lyla woke to the sound of scraping, slow, deliberate, like something dragging across the wooden floorboards. She froze, heart pounding in her chest, listening as the sound grew louder, closer. She heard her father's voice, low and rasping, far too hollow to be his. "Lyla," he called from the darkened hallway. "Lyla, come here, sweetheart. I'm hungry." The voice was his. And yet, it wasn't. A chill spread through her, a cold that sank deep into her bones. Something in that voice, something in the way he said hungry, felt wrong. She had heard that word before in old stories, legends whispered around campfires when she was younger. The Wendigo, a creature of folklore, a spirit of insatiable hunger that consumed not only flesh, but the soul itself. It was said to possess those who were driven by greed or starvation, transforming them into something monstrous, something that would never be satisfied. She had always dismissed it as superstition, but now, standing in the darkened hallway of her own home, she couldn't ignore the terror rising in her chest. Her father was standing in the doorway of the living room, his figure outlined by the dim light of the dying fireplace. His face was pale, almost sickly, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. And then it hit her, the smell. It was the scent of raw meat, sickly sweet, metallic, and thick in the air. Her father's breath came in ragged, desperate gasps as he stepped toward her, his fingers trembling. His skin, once healthy and strong, now looked sickly and stretched tight across his bones, as though something inside him was tearing at the seams to escape. "Dad," Lyla whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened to you?" Her father's mouth parted in a twisted, hungry grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. His tongue darted out, wetting his lips. He wasn't just sick. He was changing. "I'm starving, Lyla's starving." He rasped, his voice barely human now. "Please come closer. Let me feed." The words were an invitation, but they were also a warning. She felt it then, the hunger inside her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, stirring in her gut like a fire waiting to burn. Her body ached for something, anything. She could hear the distant, rhythmic beating of her own heart in her ears, and the hunger inside her grew with every passing second. Something inside her whispered, "You're becoming like him. The hunger is inside you too." She took a step back, but it was hard to resist. Her father's eyes, dark and wild, seemed to lock onto hers, and for a moment, the room was too quiet, the world too still. The wind outside had stopped. There was only the thundering of her own pulse, and the pull of the hunger that had begun to rise within her. Suddenly, she remembered the old stories, how the Wendigo was not just a monster, but a curse passed down through generations. A curse that could consume the soul, turning even the most beloved father into a beast. Her father had been struggling for weeks, pale, weak, withdrawn, but he had also been hungry, always hungry. And now, the hunger had overwhelmed him. The Wendigo was inside him. "Please, Lyla," he whispered again, the voice barely his own, now low and growling. "Come to me?" Lyla didn't know how long she stood there, paralyzed with fear and longing. It was as though something deep inside her was tearing at her, begging her to give in. Her stomach roiled, her mouth watered, and every muscle in her body screamed for release. She knew that if she let herself give in, if she stepped closer to him, she would join him in the hunger. She would become just like him. With a sudden, desperate clarity, Lyla ran. She ran for the door, ignoring the blizzard outside, ignoring the freezing cold. She had to escape, She had to break the curse before it was too late. But as she opened the door and stepped into the snow, she heard it. The whispering coming from behind her, soft but unmistakable. "Lyla, come back, the hunger." The Wendigo's voice. It was hers now too. She could feel in her chest, that gnawing, endless hunger that wanted to consume everything. The storm howled around her, but the hunger followed, crawling under her skin, gnawing at her thoughts, pulling her back into the cold. The snow, thick and suffocating, hid her father's shape, but the voice, it wouldn't stop. It called to her, echoing in her ears, mingling with the howl of the wind. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the snow, fighting it, fighting the hunger. Then she remembered something else, the stories. The one thing that could stop the Wendigo's curse, a sacrifice. She had to fight the hunger inside her. With every ounce of strength, Lyla made a promise to herself. She would not become like him. She would not let the hunger inside her take control. With trembling hands, she pressed her palms into the snow, and she whispered to the storm, to the mountains, to the woods, "I won't give in. I won't become you." The storm screamed louder, but somewhere in the distance, her father's voice fell silent. The winter of 1923 was the harshest that Creek Hollow, a small pioneer settlement nestled along the frozen plains of Minnesota, had ever known. The long, relentless cold had already worn down the settlers, their spirits brittle as the trees that lined the horizon. The snow had come early that year and hadn't let up, blanketing the ground in a heavy, suffocating white. The isolation of the settlement was nearly total. Surrounded by dense forests and icy rivers, the nearest town was days away by horse-drawn sleigh. Even with the sturdiness of their log cabins and the warmth of the hearths, the settlers knew they were at the mercy of the elements. But the worst of the storm had not yet come. It was Samuel Fields, the eldest son of the pioneering Fields family, who disappeared during the blizzard. The boy, only 16, had been out tending the horses when the storm hit with unrelenting force. His father, Gordon Fields, had told him to return to the cabin, but Samuel, eager to help with the preparations for the coming winter, had insisted he could manage. That was the last time anyone had seen him. The family waited through the night, calling his name into the biting winds, praying that he had taken shelter in one of the nearby barns or the woodshed. But by morning, when the storm had passed and the sun had risen pale and distant, Samuel was still missing. A sense of dread gnawed at Gordon's gut, but he refused to believe the worst. His son was resourceful, he thought, strong. He must have found his way to safety. It wasn't until the next day, when Gordon and his wife, Margaret, led a search party into the woods, that they found the first sign of something wrong. The tracks were deep in the snow, scattered and erratic, as though someone, or something, had been dragged through the trees. The tracks seemed to move in circles, spiraling outward like the twisted patterns of a predator's hunt. They led to a clearing where the trees grew sparse, and in the center of the clearing was an unmistakable sight, the remains of their son's coat. Torn and shredded as if by claws, its fabric stained with dark patches of what could only be blood. Margaret fell to her knees, her voice breaking on a wail that echoed through the quiet forest. "What in God's name is this?" Gordon whispered hoarsely, scanning the clearing. His heart pounded in his chest. He had seen enough death in his years to recognize the signs of animal attack. But this was different. No animal left tracks like these. No beast could tear a coat apart with such ferocity. "That's not the work of a bear," Gordon muttered, looking at his wife. His face had gone ashen. The woods were silent now, the usual sounds of birds or wind rustling through branches absent. It was then that he felt it, a presence, something unseen but watching, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "There's something out there," he said, voice low. They gathered what remained of Samuel's coat and hurried back to the cabin, hearts heavy with dread. That night, the wind howled like an animal itself, shrieking through the cracks in the cabin's walls. Gordon knew something was out there, something that had claimed his son. The next few days were a blur of fear and frantic searching. The other settlers joined in, but the deeper they ventured into the woods, the more unnerving things became. The signs of Samuel's disappearance were now accompanied by other, more sinister things. Strange tracks, large and elongated, half-human and half-beast, leading into the heart of the forest. There were strange smells, too, like rot and death, and distant sounds that echoed through the trees, faint whispers that carried on the wind. The settlers spoke in hushed tones about the Wendigo, the creature of legend that had haunted their people for generations. A spirit of the cold, an ancient being of insatiable hunger. The Wendigo was said to possess the bodies of men and turn them into ravenous, twisted monsters that devoured their own kin. It was a thing of winter, of the hunger that twisted the mind and devoured the soul. Gordon had always dismissed the old stories. They were just tales to frighten children, the kind of nonsense his father had spoken of when Gordon was young. But as the blizzard raged on, and as more signs of the creature's presence surfaced, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. One evening, as a heavy fog rolled in from the west, Gordon sat by the fire, his mind churning. He had sent men to scout the woods once again, but something told him that whatever was out there, whatever had taken his son, was no longer hiding. It was coming closer. Then, just as the wind picked up and the flames in the hearth flickered, a loud bang echoed from outside. The door to the cabin rattled, and the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard in the snow. "Stay inside," Gordon ordered, grabbing his rifle. He motioned for Margaret to take their two younger children to the farthest corner of the cabin. He was going out. The moment he stepped outside, the air hit him like a slap. The snow was thick and swirling, but in the distance he saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, moving slowly through the trees. Its shape was twisted, its limbs too long, its head too large. Its eyes gleamed with hunger. No, not hunger. Desperation. The Wendigo. Without thinking, Gordon raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, but the creature didn't flinch. It only turned its hollow, soulless eyes toward him. It wasn't his son, no. It was something else. Something that had taken his son's form. Behind him, he heard a voice, soft and almost pleading. "Papa!" It was Samuel's voice. Gordon's heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, his rifle shaking in his hands. There, standing in the doorway of the cabin, was Samuel, pale, gaunt, his body unnaturally thin. His eyes were black, hollow, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones. "I'm cold, Papa. I'm so hungry." Samuel's voice was like the wind itself, whispering, hollow, pleading. Gordon's hands trembled as he pointed the rifle at the boy he once loved. No, you're not him. You're not my son." The Wendigo's mouth twisted into a grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Then, in an instant, the figure outside lunged forward, moving with a speed that belied its grotesque form. It was on him, claws raking across his face before he could raise his rifle again. Margaret screamed from inside the cabin, but Gordon knew there was no time. The Wendigo was already upon them, and as it tore at him, his thoughts raced back to the old stories, stories of men driven mad by hunger, of the monsters they became. He realized too late that the Wendigo's curse was not just on his son. It was on them all. The hunger had begun to grow inside, every one of them. When the other settlers arrived at the cabin in the morning, they found only the remnants of Gordon Fields and his family, bloody, broken, and ravaged by something that no man should ever face. The Wendigo was gone. The storm had passed, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. But something lingered, something cold and insistent, like a shadow, waiting for the next man to give in to the hunger. And so, in Creek Hollow, the legend grew. As the settlers tried to rebuild, the cold whispers of the Wendigo never left them. Trust began to erode. The hunger was always there, lurking beneath the surface. And the woods beyond the settlement, forever untamed, forever hungry, waited. It had been a perfect day for hiking when Rachel, Tom, Emily, and Jake set out along the rugged trail in the Colorado Rockies. The air was crisp and fresh, and the scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the faint aroma of their packed lunches. The group, all college friends, had been looking forward to a weekend getaway in the wilderness. They'd heard about the trail from an old friend, a seasoned hiker who'd spent years exploring the area. It was a well-known route, one that passed through stunning views of mountain ridges, lush forests, and sparkling lakes. But it was also said to be haunted, a rumor that had circulated among the locals for decades. The story went like this. There was an old camping site nestled deep in the woods, a site that had been abandoned for years. It was said that a group of hikers had disappeared there, leaving nothing behind but signs of a struggle, clothing, broken gear, and eerie, cryptic markings carved into the trees. Some believed the camp had been cursed, haunted by a malevolent spirit, the Wendigo, a creature of hunger and madness that preyed on the lost and the lonely. No one really knew what happened to the campers who had vanished, but most agreed it was best to avoid the area. Naturally, Rachel, Tom, Emily, and Jake had laughed it off. They were city kids, rational, modern, and skeptical of old legends. Ghosts, curses, Wendigos, it was all just folklore. It wasn't until they stumbled upon the camp that things began to unravel. Late in the afternoon, after several hours of hiking, the group came across a small clearing in the woods. At first, they thought it was a natural resting spot, a place where other hikers might have set up camp. But as they moved closer, they noticed the remnants of tents, long collapsed into the snow. A rusted cooking pot sat forgotten on a campfire pit, and a faded tarp was stretched across a nearby tree. The entire place looked ancient, old, like it had been left behind for decades. "This is it," Jake said, his voice quieter than usual. "The lost camp." Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't the wind, which had grown sharper as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. It was the feeling that the place had been waiting for them. It felt wrong. "I thought this place was just a legend," Emily muttered, stepping back. "The locals talk about it like it's cursed." Rachel shrugged. "It's probably just an old campsite. Maybe someone abandoned it years ago. Let's have a look around." The group spent the next hour poking around the camp, snapping pictures and rummaging through the old, decayed belongings. Jake found a tattered journal wedged between some rocks. The pages were yellowed, and the handwriting was nearly illegible, but a few words stood out in bold, frantic script. "Hunger. No food. It's coming for us." Rachel felt her stomach turn as she flipped through the pages. The journal's entries grew increasingly erratic, culminating in the final, terrifying words. "It's here. The Wendigo. It hungers. We are the prey." "Okay, that's freaky," Tom said, tossing the journal aside. "We should go." But as they turned to leave, a chill swept through the camp. It wasn't the mountain air, but something else. Something colder. It seemed to come from the trees, from the deep shadows that stretched unnaturally long in the fading light. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered. Rachel froze. At first, it was just the sound of the wind, the crackling of dried leaves and branches. But then, faintly, there was a voice. A low, guttural whisper. "Help!" The group looked around in confusion. "Did someone call out?" Jake asked, scanning the darkening woods. "I don't hear anything," Tom said, shaking his head. "You're imagining it." But Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The voice. It was too real, too close. It wasn't an echo. It was someone or something calling out for help. It was human, but it wasn't right. It was wrong. "Guys, I think we should go," Rachel urged, a nervous edge creeping into her voice. But before they could turn around, something else caught their attention. A figure moving in the trees at the edge of the camp. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shrouded in shadow. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, and its eyes, they were black, empty, and gleaming in the dim light like two pools of ink. The group froze, paralyzed with terror. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered, voice shaking. The figure did not move toward them. It simply stood, watching. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone, vanished back into the dark forest. "Did you see that?" Emily gasped. "I saw it," Jake muttered, his voice trembling. "It's the Wendigo. It has to be." "No way," Rachel said, shaking her head, trying to make sense of it all. "It's just some wild animal. Maybe a bear or something. We're just tired. We're imagining things." But none of them believed that. Not after what they'd seen. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping rapidly as night fell. The group gathered their things, ready to leave, but as they began to walk back toward the trail, they noticed something. One of them was missing. "Where's Jake?" Emily asked, her voice rising with panic. They turned, frantically scanning the area. The trail they had walked to get there was clearly visible, but there was no sign of Jake. "Jake!" Rachel called out. "Where are you?" No response. They searched the camp, but Jake was gone. The others began calling his name, running back through the trees, but the night was unnervingly quiet. It felt as though the forest itself had swallowed him whole. No footsteps, no sounds, just the wind whispering through the branches. Hours passed. The storm clouds had gathered, and the snow began to fall again, thicker this time, coating everything in white. It wasn't until Rachel stumbled upon a fresh set of tracks that she realized the truth. The tracks led deeper into the woods, far away from the trail they had walked on. The footprints were large, unnatural, too large for a human, and they weren't going in any kind of direction a person would. The group followed the tracks reluctantly, terror slowly creeping in. The longer they followed, the more frantic their search became. Soon, they were no longer calling out for Jake, but for their own survival. The woods had swallowed them, and they were now lost in its vast, oppressive silence. Eventually, Rachel and Emily found themselves standing in a small clearing, beneath a tall, gnarled tree. Hanging from its twisted branches were human bones, tied together with thick ropes. Beneath them, written in the snow, were the same frantic words Jake had read from the journal. "It hungers. It will consume us all." Rachel's heart stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto something in the shadows. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was Jake. His face was pale, his clothes torn, his eyes hollow and wide. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Only a low, raspy breath, a sound like wind through dead leaves. I couldn't escape," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible, as if the wind itself was trying to steal his words. His lips curled into a sickly grin. Behind him, the shadow moved. The Wendigo. It was standing tall and gaunt, its limbs twisted and grotesque, its hunger evident in the hollow, black eyes that stared at Rachel. Jake's body swayed unnaturally, as if the Wendigo had already claimed him. And then, in an instant, Rachel understood. Jake had been taken. And now, it was their turn. The hunger was inside the woods. The hunger was waiting. The last thing Rachel remembered before the Wendigo's jaws closed around her was the chilling whisper in her ear. "Help!"
As the shadows grow long and the echoes of the unseen linger in the air, we hope you enjoyed tonight's chilling tale. If the darkness has left you shivering, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Uncovering more spine-tingling stories that will keep you awake at night. Good night, if you dare.